Most leaders expect to receive respect. But do you know why it's important to give it? And how do you approach respect when you have a dynamic, diverse, and geographically spread out team? Today, we are talking to award-winning, best-selling author Gregg Ward. Gregg is on a mission to transform leaders and organizations through the power of respect. Embracing respect is the perfect way for TLCG to start off the new year. Listen in to learn how you can instantly show your team your commitment to being a respectful leader. Welcome to the Leadership Coaching Group's podcast. I'm your host, Liz Howard, an entrepreneur, author, and executive leadership coach. This is where I introduce you to the top experts that discuss the burning topics that leaders at all levels need to know about. My goal is to help you become a leader that you are confident others will want to follow. So, subscribe to the show, listen in weekly, and watch your confidence as a leader grow. Hello, Gregg. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure.
Now, I wanted to ask you a quick question, if it's okay. How do you prefer to be addressed? Is it Liz or Ms. Howard? What do you prefer?
Oh, well, thank you for asking. Liz is just fine.
Great.
May I ask what prompted the question?
Well, I think sometimes a lot of us tend to assume how people want to be addressed. And I think it's part of being a respectful leader to just say to somebody, hey, how would you like me to address you? Do you prefer I use your first name, or would you prefer Mr. or Doctor or Ms.? What works for you? And it just shows the other person that you're offering them a little bit of respect and the opportunity to tell you how they want to be addressed.
I think that that's a wonderful point. And I really must say that I've never asked any of my guests that before. So this is kind of a bit of a teaching moment for me too. And I do appreciate the question. I work a lot with the Air Force Research Laboratory. And, more often than not, I've heard some people say when they're a little earlier in their career, well, people just assume that I don't have my PhD yet, so they don't refer to me as doctor when appropriate. Or if they do have a certain military rank, there are times when it is highly appropriate to use that and other times when it's not necessary. So this is a very important question. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Thank you very much. Happy to do so.
So you specialize in really kind of talking about respect and respectful leadership. What is it that inspired you to be focused on this topic of all the many leadership topics that are out there?
Well, thank you for asking. It's something that I've been working on for a long, long time. I actually began my career back in the 80s as a professional actor, writer, director, and producer in the theater in New York City. And I quickly learned that while people find actors to be somewhat fascinating and even very entertaining, they don't necessarily respect them very much. And as I look back through my life and the work I've done, respect plays a big role in who I am and who I want to be. And I am concerned that there isn't enough respect in the world. And so I've been working in this area for about 20 years now, 25 years, trying to understand it and see how the differences are made by behaving respectfully or not in people's lives and in their work. So it really was triggered by working as an actor. And then eventually I got a job that changed my life. I was hired by the New York City Police Department to create a training program using professional actors to train cops. And I was the writer, director, producer, and I cast it. And the program was far more successful than anybody, including the police department, ever thought it would be. And it sort of set me on a lifelong journey of using the tools of professional theater and executive coaching and consultation, very much what we call experiential learning, to help people understand the interpersonal skills that we all need to develop as leaders. So respect just seems to be, to me, a fundamental core tenet of what it means to be a leader.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, but I want to make sure that we're kind of, and the listeners are all kind of looking at this through the same lens. So you have a broad background. You've been doing this for a long time, and you've spent time in New York, London, California. I mean, you've certainly been in many places. And I think that with traveling, it gives you exposure to different ways that people live their lives. So is respect always the same thing depending on where you are, or does that change? How much of it's situational? Can you kind of tell us how you define respect?
That is an excellent question. The fundamental definition that I like to use for respect is essentially treating others in the way you would like to be treated, but also in the way that they would like to be treated. You know, the old golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But it's also the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And it's about practicing both of those things together, because we need to recognize that not everybody wants to be treated the same way. And I'm glad you asked about culture. I had the opportunity to work as a freelance correspondent on assignment throughout Western Europe for about 5 years for BBC Radio and the Times of London, and a weekly newspaper called Scotland on Sunday. And I traveled all over Europe. And I'll give you a classic example. In Greece, part of respect is making connection with someone, sitting down with them, having a coffee or having a drink, and just connecting with them on a very personable, friendly kind of level. But I couldn't necessarily say that was the case in Germany or in parts of the UK, which were more business focused. And let's get down to business, let's get it done. And yes, we'll socialize after the fact. So I saw a lot of cultural differences. And when you travel to Asia, for example, being respectful is sometimes means not looking somebody in the eye very directly. If you look at them too directly, many Asian people feel like you're staring at them, and it can be uncomfortable for them. Whereas in Western culture, very much we want to look each other in the eye. We're very direct with our communication. So the point is, not everybody's the same, of course. I've met many people in Western culture who don't want to be looked directly in the eye, would prefer not to have that. And many in Asian culture who are absolutely, totally comfortable with you looking them right in the eye. So the important thing is to ask. The important thing is to inquire. There's no downside to saying to someone respectfully, how would you like me to treat you? What would you like from me in order for our relationship to work well?
Yeah, I love what you're saying. And it seems like kind of the root or the foundation of that is to approach it with some curiosity and almost it being a bit humble, I guess, because you do have
Yes.
to listen first and act second then, right? Instead of coming in and just assuming I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I know all, and you conform to how I do business, right?
Exactly. I love what you said about approaching everyone with curiosity, because we all are very unique individuals. And most of us don't want to be treated exactly the same way. Now, it's entirely possible that you and I do like to be treated in many ways exactly the same, but it's also entirely possible that we have other ways that we want to be treated, that unless we as leaders put the effort in to find that out, we're likely to step on toes. And when people's toes are stepped upon when it comes to respect, one of the things I try to help everyone I work with understand, it's not a logical thinking, higher level cognitive process when you feel respected or disrespected. It's really a very emotional reptilian process that occurs in the most primitive parts of your brain.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Let's say, for example, that you, as we started talking, really do prefer to be called Ms. Howard or Dr. Howard, just for argument's sake. And I didn't inquire on that with you. And I kept calling you Liz, Liz, Liz. Well, after a while, you're polite and professional. You probably wouldn't call me on it, but there'd be a part of you that goes to yourself, geez, what a jerk. He didn't bother to find out what I prefer to be called. And that reaction is the result of your brain perceiving what I've done, what you consider to be disrespectful, as a threat. And that occurs way down in the brain stem, and where all of our autonomic functions occur, but also we perceive threat, we assess threat. And then we send that message up into the amygdala, which is really hard to pronounce, but it's basically the drugstore of the brain. It gives the signals to send out hormones into our system. So if you're feeling disrespected by me, Liz, not only do you have a threat response and you go into what's called fight, flight, or freeze, although it can be very subtle, you're then going to be filled up with hormones such as cortisol, known as the stress hormone, adrenaline, and something called norepinephrine, which is also really hard to pronounce. But these hormones in your system will trigger an emotional response in you. And if you've ever been triggered by a hormonal or emotional response, which all of us have, you know there's not a lot of thinking going on. There's not a lot of rational cognitive thought going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's just this reaction. And once I help leaders understand that even when they do little things that people perceive as disrespectful, those people are going into an emotional response. They're not being thoughtful. They're just having an emotional response. And that's very hard to get past.
Oh boy. I relate to that so well. I mean, personally, and I've seen it as a coach as well, but right, I very recently had a baby. I mean, less than a month ago, and I'm sleep deprived. And I've got to say that emotional side.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I have toothpicks holding up my eyelids right now, but that emotional side takes over when, certainly being tired, right? And I'm hearing you say this, and I'm like, yeah, there's usually not a lot of thoughtful consideration, but but when we're talking about something like a threat response, that's really interesting because what I've observed generally, I work with organizations more than individuals. And so if there's a person, let's go back to the PhD example, that feels that, okay, they're a young PhD and they're a woman in a hierarchical environment, and you will only call her Miss instead of Doctor. I've seen it manifest as this entire organization is sexist, or, this whole group does not support my group, or whatever it may be. And then organizationally, it just creates this toxic culture. So it's not just one person having an emotional reaction. It kind of seems to breed a cohort having a similar kind of feeling. Is that normal?
Absolutely. I say that disrespect is infectious. So is respect. But one person treating someone disrespectfully, who that person then has an emotional reaction to it, people pick up on those emotions. And if they too find the behavior disrespectful, they will have an emotional response as well. Not as much as the person who was the target of the disrespectful behavior, but certainly they'll have an emotional response. And when we're working together in tight quarters and we're trying to get things done, that kind of feeling can quickly go through an organization incredibly fast. So what's also troubling is the example you gave, is how often is that culture calling a young man who's a PhD by his first name or Mr. instead of giving his designation of doctor. I would argue that it's very likely they would call him doctor more than they call the young woman who's a PhD, if that makes sense.
Unfortunately, I've found that to be true. Yeah, more than anecdotally. So, it is a little tricky. So, I'm going to put myself in my listener's shoes. So, if you are a leader, especially kind of a mid-level leader, but even a senior leader, and you have quite a few people on your team that you work with, it seems a little bit easier to talk one-on-one and say, Gregg, we're going to be working together on a podcast. How do I address you? What will work for you here? Versus saying, hey, group of 50 or 100, how do I interact with you? How do you recommend that a leader approaches a larger group opposed to just maybe a one-on-one conversation to kind of learn about how to be respectful?
If they're new to the group, I would be very, very transparent. I would say, folks, obviously I'm new to this group and I don't know a lot of you. It's my intention to get to know each and every one of you individually. For the time being, I'm going to do my best to behave in a way that I consider respectful to you. And I hope you'll understand that I'm just getting to know you. It may take a little bit of time to find out your preferences and the way you like me to communicate with you and how you like to hear with me. And now let's move on. Here are my goals for this group. Here's what we're doing. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time doing this, but I would simply state it at the beginning, what is often called declaring reality. The reality is I'm new and I don't know a lot of you. I'm going to do my best to get to know you, but for now, I'm going to behave this particular way as I get to know you. Just wanted to let you know. I hope that works for you. Moving on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, here's something that I've spoken openly about on the show before. When working with certain organizations, and I'm going to guess based on what I've heard from your work, you've experienced this too. Sometimes when we talk about these types of issues, there are those out there that might consider it sort of fluff, or they're worried that it's just going to take up all their time talking to people about how they feel instead of getting work done. How would you respond to comments like that? Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the show so far. You know, TLCG does more than just podcasts. We work with organizations to help minimize internal conflict, maximize productivity, and help support current and aspiring leaders grow into the most effective stewards possible. Reach out to us to help with individual issues, team issues, or to be speakers at your next event. The best way to get in touch with us is just to visit our website at theleadershipcoachinggroup.com and send us a message through our contact page. All right, let's get back to the interview.
Well, actually do get that all the time. Everyone's a snowflake.
Yeah.
People are too soft. People need to grow a thicker skin. What's the matter with people these days? So here's the issue. Our culture has shifted. Anyone who denies that our culture, especially our workplaces, there's been a fundamental shift in our workplaces. And I say to them, first of all, does anyone, raise your hand, does anyone remember a time where sexual harassment was really rampant and everyone just had to shrug their shoulders and say, that's just the way it is. If I want to keep my job, I just got to ignore it and figure out a way to get around it because nobody cares and nobody's going to do anything about it. And quite a few hands go up. Well, we're finally reaching the point in our culture where sexual harassment is a problem. We are finally acknowledging that this is a problem and that it's a very expensive problem and that we need to find ways of addressing it. Well, the same goes for respect. We're finally finding that the old ways of being a leader, the command and control way of being a leader, do as I say because I'm your boss, really pisses a lot of people off.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually very, very counterproductive. From the research I've done, and I don't have hard numbers on this, but 90% of us who are accomplished adults have reached adulthood. And I'm talking anybody around the age of 22, 24, anything above that. Most of us don't want to be commanded and controlled by our boss. We'd like to be asked. We'd like to be given the challenge and told, go do it. You're a smart person. Make it work. Figure it out. But most of us don't like to be bossed around and commanded and controlled. So one of the things as leaders in today's workplace we need to understand is that it's our job to motivate our people, to help them understand how we are all working in this together and we're all going after the same goals and achieving things as a team. It's not me, just you, the boss, telling you what to do. It's not just me as the boss telling you what to do. It's me valuing what you bring to the table and understanding that you are a unique individual and treating you with just a simple amount of respect instead of telling you, asking you. I mean, it's not that hard. The other answer I have, and please forgive me, Liz, for rabbiting on here. The other answer I have is, just because you were beat up and treated badly as you were paying your dues and moved up through the ranks doesn't make that right or what you should be doing to the people who now work for you.
Yes. Yes. I couldn't agree with that more. So, and this is like a humongous question, and maybe we can just kind of, I don't know if you have research or any deep knowledge on it, but I'm curious, do you have any ideas about where the root of this change has come from? Is it because we have a more or less job market, or we're just having different conversations in this era? But why do you think it is that the command and control structure just isn't working so well in this day and age?
I think that is the most important question that most people want to know, and I really appreciate you asking. I wish, Liz, I could tell you I had the answer.
It's big, right?
What I can say is there have been a lot of changes, culturally speaking, in our workplaces. Everything from open space, which many people find disrespectful, to remote working. You name it. There's been a lot of changes going on. At the same time, you look back historically, and most people in the old days also bristled when their boss used command and control leadership with them. And yet, as I said about sexual harassment, everybody kind of had to shrug their shoulders. If you want to keep your job, if you want to move up in this company, then you got to play the game and put up with the abuse. And in today's low unemployment market, or what they call full unemployment, you know what? My millennial son, I have three millennial kids, two of whom work for others. Their attitude is, look, if you're going to treat me like, excuse me, crap, I'll go find another job that pays me just as much and probably will treat me better.
Mhm.
And so, as a leader, you just can't assume that it's okay to be abusive, it's okay to be command and control, because if you do, you're very likely in this economy to lose those good people that you want to keep around. So, yes, we've changed, but also what the old styles of leadership have always been there, but we've not seen any options before now, and we're suddenly starting to realize with what I call the respectful leadership movement, the conscious capitalism movement, the for benefit organization movement. All of these movements are saying, hey, command and control isn't sustainable. It works in the short term. We can achieve a mission, we can accomplish it in a short term, but over time, command and control leadership style is exhausting. It's unsustainable. There are poor outcomes. You got a lot of turnover, a lot of complaints. And really, is it worth it for us to be that way? And some people say, yeah, that's just the price of doing business. I disagree. I think there are other ways you can choose to be as a leader that are much more effective, much more respectful, and much more sustainable, quite frankly.
I love it. I agree with you completely. Many, many tweetable phrases in in your commentary there. But let's look at it from kind of the flip side. So for leaders, certainly there's a way to easily ask the question and take the stage and sort of say to their team, I want to be respectful of you. I want to learn about how this can work for you. Is there a way for someone who's in a subordinate role to kind of manage up and kind of drive this leadership change from the bottom up?
Yes, I call them respectful remarks. Sometimes we have to go to our bosses and have the courage to say, you know, boss, I'm a little unclear about what the goal is here, what the mission is here. Can you give me some guidance? Can you give me some direction? And I admit that sometimes takes courage, because we want to show our bosses that we can do the job and they don't need to micromanage us and all that kind of stuff. So if we are confused, if we are lacking in direction and guidance, then we need to be willing to ask it. That's one thing. The second thing is to be able to give our bosses feedback in a way that they can hear it. There's a wonderful book and there's wonderful work being done on what's called crucial conversation.
Mhm.
And some of those techniques are about being very honest and candid with our bosses, but making sure we couch what we say with respect. A classic example is using the what's called the contrasting statement. Hey, boss, I'm sure you didn't intend for me to be confused. I think you were just trying to move forward quickly. And unfortunately, I am confused, and can you help me out? So that's a contrasting statement. It's basically says, I don't think you intended to do this. Unfortunately, here's the impact it had on me. That's one way to do it, and it's likely to get the person to hear you. The other thing you can say is, and this is a great one, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't bring this to your attention.
Hmm.
So part of our job is to have our boss's backs too. When our boss makes a mistake or is on the verge of making a mistake or falling off the edge of a cliff, sometimes we have to go in, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, boss, I need to say something candidly to you. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't bring something to your attention." Now, if you've got a halfway decent boss, they'll thank you.
Right.
And if you don't, they might tell you to get lost. And that kind of tells you where you stand with that boss, but at least you try. And the final issue that we face is the power differential. It's very difficult for me to go to my boss and say, "Hey, boss, I find the way you're treating me to be disrespectful." So there's a technique that comes out of the Center for Creative Leadership, where I'm an executive coach. And the technique is called SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact. So what you need to do is go to your boss and say, "Hey, boss, do you remember this meeting?" And the classic example I always use is where the boss is cutting us off or interrupting us in the middle of our sentence. "Hey, boss, do you remember that meeting yesterday we were having? And what I noticed is as I was trying to make my points, you were interrupting me." And now their boss is going to get defensive at that. "I wasn't interrupting you. I was just trying to get things moving along." And you say, "I get that. I know that your intention was to have me feel disrespected by that. However, I did feel a little bit disrespected. So I'd like to," and that's the impact of the behavior. That's SBI. "So I'd like to make a request if possible. If is it possible to let me finish what I have to say? And I commit to you that I will be brief, I will be brilliant, and I will be gone." So
Hmm.
you kind of offer your boss, you ask them to change what they're doing, and then you offer them a commitment in return. In 9 times out of 10, if you've got a halfway decent, respectful boss, they'll pick up on all of that. They'll thank you, and it's very likely that behavior will change. If you don't have a respectful boss, if you've got someone who believes in command and control, you'll be lucky if they don't call you a snowflake and throw you out of their office. But again, you then know where you stand, and you have to look at your options and decide: is it worth it for me to stick around in this situation, or do I need to find another place to be?
Right. And I think that it's very easy to identify some companies or conversations or media trends where this is being done poorly. But do you have any examples of organizations that are doing this really well and kind of maybe a story or an example of how it's benefiting them?
Sure. This one may surprise you: Costco.
Mm.
I don't know if you're a Costco member,
We are,
but
yeah.
yeah, a lot of us are. And do you remember during the Great Recession that began in 2008? Well, from what I understand, the CEO of Costco at that time said, "You know what? We're going to give an across the board 15% increase to all of our associates and all of our managers, everybody who worked here." Now, the businessman or businesswoman would say, "What? What are you doing? The economy's going to heck in a handbasket. Why would you give everybody a 15% raise?" And his argument was, "You know what? The last thing we need is our associates and our managers, our teams being afraid in this economy, and that fear of maybe losing their job or having cutbacks. That fear is going to infect our customers. And that's the last thing we want our customers to feel, is our employees feeling unsure." Well, guess what? Throughout the recession and at many years afterwards, Costco's numbers were going up and up and up. So it was a very compassionate and respectful thing to do, and it had a lot of good impact both on the people who worked there, where turnover, retail turnover is, and please forgive me, I'm rabbiting on. Retail turnover could be 35 to 45%. Well, in Costco, it's a heck of a lot lower. It's like half that, not even a third of that. So Costco really benefits from treating its people with respect.
And you used an interesting term before that. You said there was an element of compassion. Is there a crossover between compassion and respect?
I do think so. We all go through tough times in our lives, no matter what. And sometimes having a boss who just says, "Hey, are you okay?" It makes all the difference. Who just checks in with you and senses something's up with you. They've developed their emotional intelligence to the point where they can be compassionate. Now, of course, there are always people who are always in crisis. I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody who's always in crisis. And after a while, the last thing the boss wants to say is, "Are you okay?" Because they're going to get a very lengthy explanation of the latest crisis. But most of us with our bosses will probably say, "Yeah, I'm fine." And then it's up to the boss to show a little compassion and say, "Here's what I'm noticing. You seem to be a little on edge, and I wouldn't be doing my job as your boss if I didn't bring this to your attention. Do you need some time? Is there something I can help you with? Is there anything going on that I can help alleviate some of that stress and pressure?" Now, unless you've got an employee who's deeply, deeply fearful, and there are some folks like that who never want to share anything going on personally with their boss or in their workplace. Unless you've got that kind of person, most people will say, "Hey, thanks, boss. I really appreciate it." And they'll pay attention to their own behavior a little bit more, or at least they know that they've got somebody on their side who cares. And what a difference it makes if you know your boss cares about you.
Oh, it's everything. And, I really like what you said because when I think about junior leaders and people kind of starting out or being in the middle of their career, I think that it's easy to maybe fall into this trap of believing that you have to just be so hyper professional that you're sort of stone cold and forget to have the compassionate and the human conversations with the intent of being really respectful or really professional. But based on this conversation, you can have a professionalism and a respect by bringing in some compassion and bringing in that human element. So it seems like sort of a finesse leadership skill that maybe you develop with a little experience.
I think it is. And I found that the older you are in terms of your experience managing and leading others, and the more situations that you've had to deal with, the more likely you are to have different strategies depending on the type of personality you're dealing with. It's the folks who just treat everybody exactly the same, who are just always focused on the mission without ever taking into account that human beings work here. Those are the folks who are likely to get a reputation as very tough to work for, and they'll find that they have higher turnover in their group and more conflict and more challenges. And that's our job as leaders, is to understand these things, be aware of them, develop our emotional intelligence and our compassion for others. And I think if we do, I truly think if we do, if we practice these things on a regular basis, we can consider ourselves respectful leaders, and the results of that are really, really good.
Yeah. So, based on what you just said, and you may have answered the question, but how do you define leadership?
It's a great question. You know, over the years, I've heard lots of definitions of leadership, and I think that really it boils down to two things: having the internal confidence and the external skills to influence others to go in a desired direction. So that's essentially having the internal confidence and the external skills, how people perceive that you are, that will enable them to be willing to go in the direction you want them to go. And I'm not talking about command and control leadership, because that's not influencing. That's just commanding. That's just ordering. And by the way, there are certain situations, such as the military. I know both you and I have worked with the military a lot, where command and control leadership is life saving. If we're in the middle of a firefight, we can't stand around and have a respectful conversation. "Well, Liz, what do you think we should do? Greg, I don't know. What do you think we should do?" No, someone's got to take charge. and give orders and commands, and that's how people's lives are saved. This is true also in the police departments and fire departments. We don't have time. We've got to move forward, and that's appropriate. But when lives aren't at stake, when the house isn't burning down, we can be more respectful, and we can influence people rather than command them or order them about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really, really, really good. So, as we're getting pretty close to time here, unfortunately, I feel like there's so much more I would love to talk to you about. But there's one question that I like to ask all of my guests, and that is, if you had just one piece of advice to offer to a newly minted leader, what would it be?
Be quiet.
Oh, yes.
Listen, listen to your people. Look at them, listen to them, sense what's going on with them, get to know them, and do a lot less talking than you might expect that you're supposed to do.
I love that. I remember hearing how it was a CEO of a concrete company. I can't think of his name, but he said that when he was taking over leadership of any, and these were always enormous companies that he was taking over, that he'd go on a listening tour. So he'd spend the
Mhm.
first 3 to 6 months just listening to folks before giving any orations or, sweeping visions or anything else. He would just go site to site and listen.
Yep. And if I may, if there's time, I just wanted to tell you a quick story.
Please.
The CEO, I was hired by the CEO of Air Gas and Chemicals, a big chemical company back east in New Jersey, and I went to that tortured wasteland with all those towers and burning off flames and things like that. And I went to meet the CEO, and I walked into the headquarters, and they said, "Oh, he's not here." And I said, "Oh, have I made a mistake?" They said, no, he's where he always is, out with the workers. And so
Wow.
let's get into a little golf cart, and we'll try and find him. And we found the CEO down on his knees in front of a piece of equipment with a couple of people working in maintenance, discussing what this particular piece of equipment and the challenges they were having with it, and how much it was costing the company, and what they could do to fix it. And there he was on his knees having a very strong and powerful conversation with them. And apparently, this is what he did with everybody. He listened to what they had to say, offered advice, and let them get on with it. And this is how he always was. So I was really fortunate to meet him 20 some odd 5 years ago. And boy, he made an impression on me and what it means to be a leader. He was a listener.
No, that's a great story. That's a great story.
Thanks.
I'm sure that people are going to want to know more about you, and you've written a book and you have this great experience. So where can people go to learn a little bit more and stay in touch with you?
They can go to my website, greggwardgroup.com. And Gregg is spelled with 3 G's, Gregg. It's all my mother's fault. Ward and group, all one word, greggwardgroup.com. Tell you all about us. You can get in touch with me, sign up for my newsletter on respectful leadership. And thank you for asking.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Gregg. This has been a really information-packed and really, really good conversation. So thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. All right, guys, that is all that we have for you this week. Until next time, bye-bye. Hey, guys. If you're getting anything out of this show, please head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. I read every single one, and honestly, your feedback is single-handedly what keeps this show going. So go to iTunes and let us know you're listening. Thank you so much for being a part of our community.